So we've been exploring the changing light, as I've kind of dubbed it. These questions that have been arising for us as Jesus people when modern Christianity and modern culture keep rubbing up against each other. Because when things rub up against each other, things come to light, things get revealed, questions rise up. Now during the season of Lent, we're going to be spending our time in the Gospel of John, but just as an FYI, I may come back with one more message in this series after our breakfast next week, the week after that. I'm not sure. We'll see. Because the Lord really spoke to me something that fits in this week that I may have to let come out of my soul. A good thing. My sermon this morning is titled, "Have Questions of Justice Found Our Gospel Wanting?" There's a lot of talk about social justice in the broader culture these days, again. And I say again because while over the last few decades we've talked about, our culture has been talking and dealing with a number of social and societal issues, recently more people in American culture are becoming aware of social justice as a category which encompasses a wide variety of issues that have to do with how various groups of people in our culture experience life and experience their place in American life. And this, if I can just say it this way, this gets tricky for Christians. Because historically, Christians have been divided over whether questions of social justice have value or not. So when it becomes a larger conversation in the broader culture, as it is right now, which you probably are aware of, as it becomes a bigger conversation in the broader culture, it reawakens and reinvigorates that conversation among Christians. One of the things that can be confusing when we talk about all this is simply the question, what do we mean when we talk about justice? The concepts of justice and fairness and equality, they're all pretty closely related. Fairness and equality they're more comparative terms. Like when we talk about fairness and equality, we're asking, is someone receiving or being treated in a manner that is the same as how other people are being treated or what other people are receiving? It's more of a comparative thing. The term justice, on the other hand, generally appeals to something higher, like a shared idea of what is moral, or how we think people should be treated according to the norms or laws of a society. And all of those are valid and helpful, but I just want to suggest to you as kind of a starting place for these thoughts this morning, and it's going to sound really simple, I just want to suggest to you that as a Christian, I should root my idea of justice in the thoughts of God. Because they can be rooted in a variety of places. And contrary to what some Christians have sometimes thought, there's a fair amount in the Bible about justice. There's actually a verse in the Old Testament minor prophet of Amos that when Christians do finally get around to talking about justice, usually gets quoted. And I would like to share that with you because I think it's worth hearing in this context this morning. Although where I want to start in Amos chapter 4 at the very beginning and read you a few verses. So this is what we find in the beginning of Amos chapter 4. This is a word to the people of Israel. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan. How's that for a starting place? And he's not talking to the livestock. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring wine, let us drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness, behold, the days shall come upon you when he will take you away with fish hooks, and your posterity with fish hooks, and you will go out through broken walls, each one straight ahead of her, and you will be cast into Harmon, says the Lord. Now, I know Katie's got this look on her face like, right? It's kind of like in Job when God says, brace yourself, and now I will speak to you. So, first of all, the word cow is not in itself a derogatory term, by the way, because in ancient times, when life was very agrarian, people were often analogically compared to the best qualities of the animals, of livestock. That's why, for example, in the Song of Solomon, the lover says to his beloved, your breasts are like the twins of a gazelle. That's a compliment, right? So the cow thing is not bad, except for this, that these cows have fattened themselves. He's actually aiming this at rich women. That's why he says, who say to your husbands, bring wine, let us drink. These cows have fattened themselves at the expense of the poor and needy by oppressing the poor and needy. So then he goes on and he says, so come to Bethel. That's the house of God. The Lord says, come to Bethel and transgress. Like saying, come to church and sin some more. At Gilgal, another worship place, multiply your transgressions. Bring your sacrifices every morning. Bring your tithes every 3 days. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving with leaven. Proclaim and announce the freewill offerings. For this you love, you children of Israel. He's saying you just love your worship stuff. But you oppress the poor and the needy. And so when you get further down into chapter 5, God repeats this thing of basically saying, I despise your worship. He says, I despise your feast days, Amos 5:21, and I do not savor your sacred assemblies. Though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, nor will I regard your fattened peace offerings. This verse really gets me. Take away from me the noise of your songs. Take away from me the noise of your songs, for I will not hear the melody of your stringed instruments. And then here comes the verse. This is the verse you always hear quoted from this passage. But let justice roll down like a river and righteousness like a never-ending stream. I don't care about your worship when you're oppressing poor people, when you don't have a heart for the needy. I don't care about these things. Now, Amos lived in the 700s BC, so 700 years roughly. 7.5 centuries before Jesus, around the same time as the prophets Hosea and Isaiah, which is why when you read their words in the Old Testament, you see that they're talking about very similar themes when they describe Israel's unfaithfulness. A lot of it is about this, how they care for the lesser of society. What's interesting about Amos is that unlike these other Hebrew prophets, he's not a professional prophet. He was a sheep herder and a fig farmer. In Amos 7:14, he says, I am no prophet nor the son of a prophet. This is a regular guy who saw the growing disparity between the rich and the poor in Israel, and it made him crazy because if he knew one thing about God, it was that the heart of God for all his children was that if one of his children was suffering, the other children should do something about it. That's what Amos was sure of. It seems like such a simple concept when you say it that way, right? Like if one of the children is suffering, one person is suffering, the other people should do. But it just goes around and around in human culture, and even the people of God often fail to get a hold of it. In the New Testament, decades after Jesus, we find Paul correcting the Christians in Corinth and essentially saying to them, right in your own church, when you celebrate your Eucharistic love feast every week, there are people there who are hungry, who had no food to bring, and the rest of you are feasting, and you don't care that there are hungry brothers and sisters at your own table in church. Still a problem, right? Even after Jesus, it's still a problem. Over in Isaiah in the Old Testament, we find the same theme of God's distaste for the religion of his own people because of their treatment of the poor and oppressed. And I don't have time to walk you through all of that, but God says the same things about disdaining their worship because of their treatment of the poor. And literally in Isaiah 58, verses 3 and 4, he says, because one of the things they would do in their worship was a lot of fasting. And he says, on the very day of your fasting, you are underpaying and beating your workers. That's what he says. On the very day of your fasting, you come to church and you make a big thing about how much you love God. But these people, you don't even treat like human beings. And then when you get to verses 6 and 7, he takes up their love of fasting, their religious love of fasting, and he uses it as an image for what he really wants them to do. And he says this in Isaiah 58, verse 6, the Lord says, is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Now, some people think that Isaiah is referring to people's relatives, but I think in the context what Isaiah is saying is he is saying these human beings that you do not care are hungry or poor or struggling or outcast. These are your own flesh. They are your human brothers and sisters, and you disregard them. So Amos, I just want to end this piece of my sermon again with Amos's powerful words. Let justice, if you didn't think the Bible talked about justice and God caring about what goes on between human beings, hopefully those passages are enough, because that's just a little sampling to make you go, oh, let justice roll down like a river and righteousness like a never-ending stream. I've given you some history in these sermons, probably a little more than my typical sermons. And is it okay if I give you a little more history this morning? Is that okay with you? I mentioned a few minutes ago that Christians have often been divided by the topic of social justice. The sharpness of that divide goes back to the early 1900s, as far as Christians are concerned in our culture. In the late 1800s, there was this movement among Protestants that emphasized the social aspects, the societal aspects of the gospel, and it gained ground particularly among American Christians. The pastors who led this movement emphasized the ethical dimensions of Jesus' teaching and the part of Jesus' teaching about prayer where Jesus said, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." In other words, Lord, may we embody in the earth, may the way you want things to be come into the earth. So they emphasized these things, and their message came to be known as the social gospel. They were concerned about issues like, among others, they were particularly concerned about issues like poverty, crime, racial tensions, slums, and child labor. And before we write off their passions just as some passing fancy of abstract idealism, consider this. In the early 1900s, mainstream Protestantism in America was largely aligned with the mainstream establishment of society. There was a very good syncopation between how Americans thought and how American Protestants thought. And part of that, one of the things that meant, is that Protestant Christians in America raised absolutely no questions about child labor. Now, maybe that doesn't seem like a big deal to you today, but to put that in perspective, the U.S. Census of 1900 showed that 1.8 million children between the ages of 10 and 15 were employed in full-time manual labor, primarily in factories, and those factories in those times boasted unclean and unsafe working conditions. And these social gospel Christians said, that's not okay. It's not okay. We should raise our voice. But Christians didn't want to raise their voice. They said, we should raise our voice about this. This is not how children are supposed to grow up and live and be treated. But when some Christians started saying that we should be bringing the teaching of Jesus to bear on these social issues, other Christians felt that this detracted from the kind of gospel they had been emphasizing, which was more about how to make sure you would go to heaven when you died and how to make sure that your personal moral choices didn't disqualify you from that. And so that reaction to the social gospel was partially responsible for the birth of today, what we call fundamentalism. So you had kind of the social gospel, and then you had this reaction that basically said, all that social stuff has nothing to do with the gospel. Nothing. So you had this divide that came to exist among Christians. Now, the social gospel movement kind of died out by about the 1920s. It started to lose its momentum. And it's really interesting to read historians on this because nobody knows exactly why. One of the more intriguing theories, which I kind of touched on in another one of these sermons, is that the social gospel died out because the social gospel as a byproduct did feed idealism that said if we would care about society, society would get better and better. And then World War I happened. And all that idealism went out the window because people said, obviously the world is not getting better and better if we're prepared to kill each other at these rates. But despite the fact that it kind of died out, the writings of social gospel theologians like Walter Rauschenbusch, those lived on, and that was significant. Walter Rauschenbusch's writings, for example, helped convince Martin Luther King that civil rights were a gospel issue for Christians like him and gave King the courage to fight to change how people thought. So that early 1900s emphasis on maybe Jesus does have something to say, maybe it is at the heart of the gospel, how we think about social things, actually came to some of its fruition in the civil rights movement, which I think we would all say was a difficult but very good thing. Deep breath. So I have spent my whole life my whole adult life in the stream of the church we call evangelicalism, which has emphasized some very good things. Having a personal relationship with Jesus, the importance of Scripture, and I've said this before, I'm incredibly grateful. You know, I first heard the good news of Jesus at 15 through the ministry of a Young Life club in my high school, and Young Life as a ministry, which is a huge organization, was a direct outgrowth of the 1940s, 50s evangelical movement. So if you say, are you grateful for that? Man, I sure am, because I was a little depressed drughead with an empty soul when through those folks Jesus came and found me. So I'm grateful for that. And yet, in evangelical circles, which I've been in all my life, I have only ever heard the phrases social gospel and maybe more importantly, social justice used derisively and pejoratively because of that divide. And the reason goes back to that divide between Christians who said the gospel is about relationship with God and making the cut, and Christians who said that the gospel is about the heart and ways of God being lived out in human society. It became an either-or in the church, which is so unfortunate. Back during the pandemic, when I preached a little on how we might navigate current social issues as Christians, which is funny because those of you who were here at that time probably remember that I caused some kerfuffle with some of those sermons. But when I say I preached a little, it was 4 sermons. It wasn't, like 2 years of pandemic cultural issue preaching. It was 4 sermons. But when I did that, I used in one sermon, I used the phrase social justice. I've used it since, but that may have been the first time I actually ever used it in a sermon. And a woman came up to me afterwards and she said to me, I don't like it when Christians talk about social justice. I don't believe in that, and I wish you would just preach the gospel. Now, she's a dear woman, but her thinking is a result of her being taught that the good news of Jesus, the good news Jesus brings, has nothing to do with issues of justice. Doesn't have anything to do with it, so why would you talk about it, Pastor Fran? And this is the danger of not knowing anything about the generations that kind of came before us of Christians. Because the generations of Christians before us were taught and informed a certain way, which then, as it trickled down, often informed and taught the people who then shaped our own faith perspectives. But if we don't know that history, we just think our faith perspectives are completely objective. We read the Bible and we know what's true and blah, and we don't realize we're actually heir to a lot of thinking that has kind of flowed down through time and found its way to us. And that's where her thinking comes from. When Jesus stands up in the synagogue in Nazareth in Luke 4, he says that he has been sent with good news. That's the word gospel. Same word. He's been sent with good news for the poor. And he has been sent to bring freedom to the oppressed. And when Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for their neglect of the poor, he sounds just like Amos and Isaiah. In Matthew 23, he brings up to the Pharisees the fact that they have tithed. There's your religiousness, right? They've tithed even off the herbs in their garden. Like he's like, you guys are really good tithers. I mean, you not only give your money, like you go out and you say, like 1 piece of basil for Jesus, 9 pieces of basil for me, right? Like you've tithed off the herbs in your garden. And then he says this, but when it comes to the poor, he says, quote, you have neglected justice and the love of God. One of the problems in the church today, as we sit here this morning, is that because of all the political and cultural arguments in the broader culture, as soon as a pastor touches on issues where Christians might need to wrestle with justice questions, he'll be accused of meddling in politics, of taking a political side, and maybe not the political side that some of his parishioners think he should take. Why does that happen? It might not be for the reason you think. I think it happens most of the time because the assumption on the part of people is that he's bringing up the issues to take a political side. Now, do you understand why people make that assumption? It's because most of the people in the pews are approaching those issues mostly from having been drawn into a political side. So I'm not saying this about you, but let's just say, right? Let's just say, if I brought up an issue and all of you are divided about it along some partisan lines, and I bring it up and I say, let's talk about it, your natural response in that frame of mind is to say, which side you on? Because there's this and there's this. There's this and there's this. Which side you on? And if there's something I want to push us on a bit this morning about justice, it's that. And I will use a couple of issues as examples, but my concern is that we become people whose views are formed by the heart of God for people, the heart of God for justice for people, and who are aware enough to recognize and resist the many voices which insist that we receive our formation on these issues from the loud voices in any partisan camp. That makes sense to you, the way I spit out that long, verbose sentence? Like, we need to become people, if we're going to successfully follow Jesus in any sense of what that means, we're going to have to become people who say, first and foremost, I want my views to be formed by the heart of God when it comes to people and justice for people. And I want to be aware enough to recognize and resist all those voices that will flood in an instant and tell me what my view should be and try to draw me into that perspective. And by the way, I don't think for a Christian that either fairness or law are the primary motifs from which we should take our cues when it comes to questions of justice. We have systems in our society that try to make things fair for people, right? And you always hear people complain about them on different sides. That's because it's very hard to create systems that ensure perfect fairness for people. We will be having those debates and tweaking those systems until Jesus comes back, I promise you. It's an unsure basis from which to think about justice. And it's good that our laws have evolved toward justice, because many of them have. I think of Martin Luther King's quote when he says, the long arc of the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. I think that's the quote. But even law can't really be a Christian starting place, because the law often lags behind what is really the justice of God. The law is often catching up to what is the justice of God. I've shared with you before that there's this one Greek word in the Bible, dikaiosune, that in some places in the Bible it's translated justice, and some places it's translated righteousness. And the reason it goes both ways is because at its root, it just has to do with making things right. Making me right, making you right, and making what happens between us as human beings right. So, for example, we Christians all got drawn into the debates about gay rights beginning in the 1970s. I wasn't tuned into all that yet. For me, it was more like the 80s. And people with very strong political agendas turned Christians into an army that would oppose the right of gay people to marry. I want you to hear where I'm going. They flooded in and said, this is the perspective you have to adopt on this issue. This is what matters about this. And we all, at that time, said, yeah, right, of course. But did you know that the real rights issue that gay people were most concerned about back in the 70s was actually the fact of the possibility of being fired for being gay, and the fact that under the law their employers had the right to do that. So all us Christians were saying, we're against gay rights. We didn't even know what the rights were that people were. We weren't even talking about all the rights that people were actually being concerned about. Do you know when federal law finally firmly established that you can't be fired for being gay? 2022. Last year. Unless, of course, you work for a company with 15 or fewer employees, if that's the case, you can still today be fired for being gay in 20 states. You go, oh. But we Christians weren't talking about that, because somebody told us what we should be talking about with regard to this whole sphere of people and things. And so we weren't even talking about it. We didn't even know, because we didn't stop and say, what's going on here? So now I'm talking about gay people, and for some of you, your political synapses in your brain are firing. But what I'm actually suggesting is that you push all that aside and start with a simple question. Does Jesus think it's just that a person be fired because they were born with same-gender desires? That's the justice question for me about that particular topic. Because if that's not your first question, what things being right would look like from Jesus' perspective, then the politically informed and often manipulative voices are going to rush in and they're going to give you a different primary question. That's what I want you to see, is that it's not just people giving us perspectives, they actually frame entire issues for us. And they say, here is what you should be talking about with this, here's what you should be thinking about this, and we get pulled in and we go, oh my gosh, yeah, but if we had a different primary question that we insisted on, which was, what does the heart of God for justice for all people look like in this particular situation? Then that would serve as a deflector to the many other voices that are trying to shape our first question and what we should be concerned about and what we should be thinking about with regard to a particular issue. Or take how we navigated the supercharged conversations about race in the aftermath of what happened to George Floyd. For a lot of Christians, that very quickly became a question of whether you were on the side of black people or the police. And don't tell me it didn't, because it did even in this church. And it was like boom or boom, boom or boom. And that was the deal. And from where I sat, there was huge pressure to pick a side. By the way, not a great moment to be a pastor. Are you for these people or the police, pastor? You know? And you're like, I'm with Jesus. I'm with Jesus. And when I tried to have a conversation with people who very loudly picked the police side, it was almost impossible to have the simple conversation about whether George Floyd, in the moment, was treated justly by the particular police officers involved. It was a hard conversation to have because what people wanted to know was, but are you for these people or the police? Are you for these people or the police? It's like, I want to talk about the justice in the particular situation. I'm not making commentary on all police. I'm not making commentary on all black people. I want to talk about the justice that unfolded in the situation. That was an almost impossible conversation to have with people. Because if I suggested that what was done to him was cruel and unjust, I was accused of choosing drug addict, criminal, looting, inner-city black people over the police. It's a false dichotomy. So again, if I've overstimulated your political synapses this morning, let me bring you back to what I am actually suggesting. I'm suggesting that because we are not terribly good at making justice, everything rightness, the way God says it should be for human beings, because we're not very good at making that our first question, we end up being vulnerable to being handed substitute primary questions, very often generated along partisan lines, and we are drawn into groupthink rather than Godthink. Remember what Soren Kierkegaard said, the crowd is untruth, be careful. So if you're a Christian, that's really what I want to simply say to you is be careful. You get handed partisan perspectives, and with them, language and phrases and sometimes boogeymen that become the weapons of shallow cultural dialogue. Have you noticed that? That dialogue can devolve in our culture into shallow cultural dialogue? Here's an example. I heard a congresswoman and self-avowed Christian recently describe critical race theory as, quote, a view that teaches our white children that their skin color makes them less than other people. Now, anyone who has actually read critical race theory and its history, and I have, and I'm not even saying everything about it is good or bad, right? But I have, knows that that is just patently not true, what she said. Just absolutely not true. Just the facts just don't bear it out. So if you're a Christian, she's not helping you sort out these questions at all. So what I want to say is push everything aside and start with the heart of Jesus for all things to be right for all people. I know it sounds so simple, doesn't it? It would be like, it sounds so simple. And understand that the voices on all sides are loud. And if you really want to start with that question, the heart of Jesus for all things to be right for all people, if you really want to start with that question, you will have to fight to be a person who starts with that. Because the voices are loud and the voices are many, and they come from a wide variety of directions. And I do think it's important that we ask why modern Christians have not been more concerned about justice issues, abortion being the exception. But beyond that, modern Christians have not been terribly concerned about justice issues overall. And I very much believe it's because we have largely been taught, I would even go so far as to say, I'm not sure it's the modern Christian's fault. It's probably more the fault of preachers, pastors, of religious leaders, and maybe even political leaders. But I very much believe that it's because we've been taught an understanding of the gospel that did not see making things right for people in this human life as part of the good news of Jesus. Just wasn't, just like what that woman said to me. I don't believe in that. It's not part of the gospel. Just preach the gospel to me. But for not being part of the gospel, Jesus talks about it a lot. Many of us were taught to accept Jesus so that we would go to heaven, and that Jesus was likely to come back in the next couple of years, and that what we should do is huddle at the departure gate rather than looking around and helping to make life right for our human brothers and sisters. I'll give you another example. I talked about this earlier in the sermon series, and I'm not trying to be unkind to anybody, to churches, groups of churches, leading denominations of churches. It's hard work, it's difficult work. But last year when it came out that the largest Protestant denomination in America had been keeping a secret list of pastors who had abused women and children. You heard what I said, right? Protestant, not Catholic. We already had, that was a couple decades ago, right? This was the hot news this last year in the church world. That they had been keeping the secret list of pastors who had abused women and children and protected them, moved them to other churches where their sins were not known, and bullied and demeaned the women who brought those accounts to them to shut them up, to silence them. When this came out, I will tell you what part of the problem was. I mean, ultimately the problem is we're sinful, screwed up people, and we desperately need our hearts to be changed and our perspectives to be changed. But I'll tell you what part of the problem was. In that Protestant denomination, they have a view of the gospel that almost never talks about justice issues. Where was the justice for those women and children? Do you think that Isaiah or Amos or Jesus would have had something to say about that? They would have said, this is an issue at the heart of God, how you see human beings, how you treat human beings, what you do to children, for God's sake. But their gospel didn't include it. Their gospel was about, here's how you get saved, here's how you go to heaven, and Jesus is coming back, and so try to be good and huddle at the departure gate, and don't worry about all this other stuff. So have questions of justice found our understanding of the gospel wanting, lacking? I think they have. I think we forgot that the point of heaven is not simply whether you get in. I think we just sometimes have been so, the way we talked about the gospel is so focused on this idea of, are you saved? Are you getting into heaven? It's like, I don't know what we picture, like we're going to get in and we're going to go, whew, made it. Where do you get a margarita? Like we think like that's the whole point is getting in, but that's actually not the point. It's not even the way the Bible talks about it. The way the Bible talks about the fullness of the kingdom of God, when that time comes, is that everything is going to be in us and among us as it was made to be. Good and whole and just and dare we say loving. I mean, that's what John the Revelator says. He has God at the end of the book of Revelation saying, behold, I'm making everything new. That's the point. So we can get sucked into all the us versus them, right? You see how this is a question, right? Changing light. This is a question. When modern Christianity and modern culture rub up against each other, this stuff happens and we got to process it. How do we see it as Christians? What do we do with it as followers of Jesus? So we could get sucked into all that, and that's kind of the way the world turns these days, but our better option is to cultivate in our own hearts and imaginations this beautiful vision of everything right for everyone. And in my mind, to my mind, it's the only perspective consonant with the love of God so beautifully revealed in Jesus Christ. And now I've used the examples of sort of these societal issues, but I'll tell you really, that's easy for me to talk about because I'm talking about other people, right? I'm talking about other people who have maybe, made a mistake on societal issues. But when I think about my own life, here's where I think justice really matters. The people that I encounter in my life. that I actually encounter, my neighbors, the people I work with, my friends, the people wherever I go? Am I concerned about how they're experiencing life? Am I asking the question, how's the everything rightness that God meant for them? How's that going? That's why we do things in our church as imperfectly as we do them, as like trying to love people on the east side of Joliet, or all the things that we've done on the southern peninsula of Haiti. Why do we do those things? Because it matters. It's not so we pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, we're these wonderful Christian do-gooders. It's because it matters what their experience of life is like. And if there is poverty, and there is injustice, and there is inequality, and there is oppression, is there something we can do to make it better? So, brothers and sisters, in our hearts and through our lips and our hands, let justice roll down like a river, and righteousness like a never-ending stream.